World War II was not only fought with guns and tanks, but with the determined labor, courage, and sacrifices of millions of women on the home fronts of nations around the globe. In every combatant country, Allies and Axis alike, women stepped into roles once held by men, enduring shortages, danger, and fatigue while keeping factories humming, farms productive, and hospitals running. In a small American factory, a young woman in a red bandana learned to handle a rivet gun and build fighter planes. In a British field at dawn, a land girl in overalls milked cows and plowed fields. In a snowy Soviet town, an engineer worked the assembly line for T-34 tanks. In occupied France, a secret messenger risked her life delivering intelligence on a bicycle. Across Germany, Italy, and Japan, women navigated propaganda and ideology to tend war production lines and even resist tyranny in secret. Their daily life was a mixture of pride and hardship, raising children by candlelight during blackouts or rationing cooked greens at meager meals, while also hauling ammunition, flying supplies, driving ambulances, or suturing wounds. Together, these stories of everyday heroines and famous figures remind us how the war effort extended far behind the front lines, with women's contributions proving as vital to victory as any battlefield strategy. When America joined the war in 1941, a flood of women entered new fields and factories. Over 6 million American women took jobs in wartime industries, many for the first time. They replaced drafted men on the factory floor, riveting the wings on B-17 bombers, welding the frames of tanks rolling off Detroit's assembly lines, and sewing parachutes or uniforms. Famous as Rosie the Riveter, these factory workers became icons, bandana-clad, arms flexed, building war machines. Real women like Rosie did exist. Girls who once answered sewing machine calls answered whistle blasts for the heavy machines. Factories hired women regardless of race or age, though segregation and prejudice remained. For example, African American women often worked in separate plants or less desirable jobs, while some still took on industrial roles in places like the Pullman Car Works. Along with factory work, women organized victory gardens at home, turning backyard plots and vacant lots into small vegetable farms to supplement strained food supplies. Women also volunteered and enlisted in unprecedented numbers. 3 million women joined or volunteered with organizations like the Red Cross, USO, United Service Organizations, and Civil Air Patrol, doing everything from knitting socks and raising money to teaching first aid. About 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps, WAC, handling clerical work, driving trucks, and managing logistics. Another 100,000 joined the WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency service in the Navy, as yeomen, radio operators, and even instructors. By 1943, the newly formed Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, had about 1,000 civilian women pilots ferrying aircraft from factories to bases, test flying new models, and towing practice targets, freeing male pilots for combat. Over 350,000 nurses served in military hospitals, aboard hospital ships, and in field units, stitched together wounds, and cared for thousands of wounded soldiers. All these roles kept the U.S. military machine running smoothly. Women typists sent telegrams to the front, pattern makers drafted parts for Jeeps, and farmwives managed huge new farms under programs like America's Land Army counterpart and domestic agriculture boards. At home, American women balanced war work with family sacrifices. With iron rations of meat, sugar, and gasoline, they learned resourcefulness, canning vegetables, mending uniforms, or washing used parachute silk into wedding dresses. They coped with anxiety, scanning headlines for news of husbands or brothers in battle. Hollywood films and posters celebrated their contributions, urging every citizen to do her part. The government's propaganda exalted the patriotic housewife and career woman alike, framing women's labor as a patriotic duty. When VE and VJ days finally arrived in 1945, many American women carried medals and hard-earned skills. though social pressure soon pushed many back into home life. By war's end, approximately 1 in every 2 American workers was a woman, a staggering figure that redefined the role of women in U.S. society. Key U.S. contributions included mass war production, 6 million women at factory machines, munitions plants, and shipyards by 1944, enabling unprecedented output of ships, tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Military auxiliaries, creation of the Women's Army Corps, 150,000 plus members, WAVES, Navy, SPARS, Coast Guard, Army Nurse Corps, tens of thousands of nurses, and 1,074 WASP pilots, all freeing men for combat. Homefront effort, millions planting victory gardens, handling rationing boards, selling war bonds, and volunteering for the Red Cross, 3 million plus volunteers nationwide. Propaganda and morale, iconic images like Rosie the Riveter and patriotic posters encouraged women to join the workforce and keep spirits high on the civilian front. Across the Atlantic in Britain, an even more dramatic mobilization took place. By 1944, 1/3 of Britain's civilian population was engaged in war work, including over 7 million women. The British government passed laws to direct labor. From 1941 onward, single women aged 20 to 30 could be conscripted either into industry or into the auxiliary services. Under Minister Ernest Bevin's oversight, women in Britain took on nearly every essential non-combat job. British factories built Spitfires, Lancaster bombers, tanks, guns, and millions of shells. On the docks and in munitions plants, women operated cranes, drove forklifts, and turned lathe machines. Famous land girls from the Women's Land Army, over 80,000 at peak, went to work on farms, often sharing modest cottages or hostels. In all weathers, they plowed fields, harvested wheat, milked cows, and chased rats out of granaries, doing heavy farm labor that kept food on tables and troops supplied. Women also filled traditionally male roles in transport and defense. They became bus and tram conductors when many men were sent overseas and helped keep the railways and the merchant navy moving. In civil defense during the Blitz, women served as fire watchers, paramedics, and air raid wardens. The women's voluntary service included special blue uniform patrols. When bombs fell on cities, these moments of normality were shattered. Yet women kept working heavy machinery by day and searching through rubble by night for survivors. In the spring of 1941, devoted volunteers and ordinary housewives marched off to join the newly reactivated Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, and Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS. By 1943, there were about 182,000 members of the WAAF maintaining radar equipment and plotting aircraft movements, 250,000 in the ATS, doing everything from cooking in army camps to serving in anti-aircraft gun units, and 74,000 WRENs working in the Navy on code-breaking and administration. Notably, many WRENs operated the secret German Enigma decoding machines at Bletchley Park. Living conditions were often harsh. British women endured nightly bomb alarms and blackouts. Mothers held children in damp shelters during raids, and by morning returned to kitchens where dinner ingredients might be starch or seaweed because supplies ran out. Meals were simple. Many families survived on carrots, powdered eggs, and powdered milk, and women learned to make do and mend, patching uniforms and gardening vegetables to cope with scarcity. Libraries and cozier moments, make-do tea parties underground, helped keep morale. Women hoped for peace while losing loved ones. Countless letters recount worry for sons in Normandy or fear of blitzed London. Yet the shared hardship fostered a solidarity. Schoolgirls and women in factories sang "We'll meet again" and cheered U.S. bombers roaring overhead.
The Soviet Union stands as perhaps the most extreme example of entire societies mobilizing women. Before the war, women already comprised a huge fraction of the labor force. After Hitler's invasion in June 1941, Soviet women shouldered the nation's survival. On collective farms, kolkhozy, they plowed steppe and planted potatoes, even while under threat of air attack. When factories from Kiev to Leningrad were evacuated eastward, women engineers, metallurgists, and assembly line workers kept production of T-34 tanks, artillery, and planes at breakneck pace. In cities and the Urals, females made up a majority of heavy industry workers by mid-war, often laboring 12-hour shifts. The mood was one of grim duty. Memoirs and reports speak of women welding armor plating at dawn, eating cold porridge at lunch, and painting rifle stocks by lamplight at night. Millions also served in uniform. Officially, roughly 800,000 Soviet women volunteered or were drafted into the Red Army by war's end, about 5% of all military personnel. Many became medics, doctors, nurses, and communication specialists. Astonishingly, Soviet female nurses and doctors tended 100% of the nursing assignments at times, and near half of all military doctors were women. The Air Force formed all-female aviation regiments under pilot Marina Ryskova. The most famous, the Night Witches, carried out night bombing raids in biplanes. There were also women snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, credited with 309 kills, and tank crew members, though historians emphasize women in support roles outnumbered them. Almost 200,000 women were decorated for valor, and 89 earned the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Even beyond formal units, countless women joined partisan bands behind German lines. They acted as couriers, scouts, and saboteurs. Stories of girls like 18-year-old Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya circulated. She volunteered for a guerrilla raid, was captured, and executed for daring sabotage. Her last words reportedly, "You can hang us, but you cannot hang all 200 million of us." Hundreds of other Soviet women died in the forests, cutting phone lines or shooting at occupiers. Meanwhile, those at home evacuated children, created home-front industries in basements, and made clothes for soldiers. Ration queues in the cities were long, and hardships many. Famine hit parts of the USSR, especially after 1943. Yet propaganda fiercely praised working mothers and factory girls for turning your plain cloth into victory. Key Soviet contributions included all-encompassing labor mobilization. By war's end, an estimated 2/3 of Soviet industrial workers were women, keeping tank and aircraft factories at full throttle while men were killed or missing. Women plowed millions of acres on collective farms and attended harvest even under bombardment. Massive medical support. Women comprised nearly half of all Soviet military medical staff and were indispensable in treating the wounded. Many volunteered as frontline nurses or Red Cross sisters amid freezing conditions. Combat and partisan service. Approximately 800,000 served in the Red Army and partisans. All-female units like the Night Witches flew 30,000 combat sorties, and women snipers and artillery crews won renown. About 100,000 Soviet women fought as partisans, with a significant number honored as heroes for their bravery. Bravery under invasion. Cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad under siege saw women evacuating hundreds of children, shoveling snow to keep trains moving, and taking up arms in desperate defense. After the siege of Leningrad, many surviving women and girls rebuilt the city's factories and homes from ruins, embodying the phrase "Bereги себе, pomogi отчизне," save yourself, help the motherland. France's situation was unique, occupied by Germany for much of the war and divided between the collaborating Vichy regime and the Free French forces. French women experienced war largely as hardships under occupation, but many also found ways to resist. Daily life meant severe rationing of meat, butter, and fuel. Mothers learned to bake bread from acorns or banana peels, and entire neighborhoods often shared coal baskets to heat apartments. Many French women who'd held white-collar jobs or small shops found themselves instead working in factories, even some controlled by the occupiers, or on farms to support their families. In rural villages, women milked cows twice a day and preserved cheese and vegetables for the winter, since oil and sugar were scarce or black market goods. But it was the clandestine struggle that highlighted women's courage. An estimated 15 to 20% of French resistance fighters were women. They took on critical roles as couriers, often on bicycles, intelligence agents, wireless operators, and safe-house hosts. In Paris, for example, young women carried messages tucked under their stockings or hid wireless sets in prams to send news of German troop movements to London. Famous figures include Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who led a major spy network, and Lucie Aubrac, who rescued her husband from capture with a clever ambush. The world-renowned entertainer Josephine Baker, who was living in France, used her celebrity tours to smuggle secret documents and weapons in her cello. Tens of thousands of resistance women were arrested, deported to concentration camps, or executed. In one brutal act, the Nazis rounded up 230 female resistants and sent them to camps in 1943. In the unoccupied Vichy Zone and Free French forces, women also contributed. Those in Free French Africa or Britain tended hospitals and ran supply lines for de Gaulle's armies. On the propaganda side, Vichy actually blamed many social problems on women, emphasizing a return to large families and condemning working women in paid jobs. But by 1944, even conservative France needed every hand. Women in factories churned out arms for the depleted French army that was re-equipped by the Allies for the liberation. When Allied troops landed, French women greeted them with bouquets. After the war, women's resilience was recognized. French women won the right to vote in 1944, in part for their wartime sacrifices. Key French contributions included resistance activities. Although a minority among fighters, female resistors played outsized roles as spies, saboteurs, and informants. Women like Nicole Minette, Simone Sigouin, and many unnamed others helped blow up bridges, distribute anti-Nazi leaflets, and carry critical messages under fire. Around a fifth of those honored as Compagnons de la Libération, heroes of the liberation, were women. Homefront endurance. While German occupiers took the best food and fuel, French women grew gardens, ran clandestine markets, and kept families alive through barter and ingenuity. The café kitchens and mères de famille groups organized soup kitchens in bombed towns. Allied support. In liberated France, women in uniform manned signals equipment and helped rebuild the postal and rail services. The French Red Cross and Medical Corps, staffed largely by women, cared for wounded from Normandy through Paris and beyond. Propaganda and symbolism. Images of strong French women, Marianne or the patriotic nurse, circulated to spur morale, while in Italy and Germany, occupied France had to suppress such nationalist symbols. Nonetheless, even sewing buttons on de Gaulle's uniforms or refusing to greet German officers were tiny acts of resistance by French women that kept hope alive. In Germany and its collaborators' territories, women's war efforts were filtered through Nazi ideology. Before the war, the Nazis had celebrated an Aryan ideal of motherhood. The 1930s Lebensborn program and the Mother's Cross Awards exemplify this. Many German women cheerfully joined Nazi organizations like the NS Frauenschaft or the Bund Deutsche Mädel, League of German Girls, promoting family life and the regime's values. But once the war demand rose, even Nazi officials had to bend their ideals. Initially, the Germans pulled back women from certain jobs to encourage larger families. By 1943, however, acute labor shortages forced 6 to 7 million more German women into war work. Factories producing Messerschmitt fighters, Panzer tanks, V-2 rockets, and munitions hired women in mass. Young girls as young as 14 were conscripted as Flakhelferinnen, teen girls who operated anti-aircraft searchlights and rangefinders to repel Allied bombers, around 330,000 by 1945. Women became riveters, weavers, machine cutters, and welders in steelworks and armament plants across the Reich. At home, German women also faced bombed cities and bombing. After the Allied air raids of 1935 to 45, massive areas of Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and Dresden lay in ruins. At night, under blackout, these cities' Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, went out into the wreckage before dawn to clear debris and rebuild streets. They hauled bricks by wheelbarrow and dug out cellars from under shattered buildings, working in silence to avoid drawing bombers. A ragged group of women, they became a symbol of post-war reconstruction. German women also staffed civil defense. Hundreds of thousands volunteered in the Luftschutz, Ambulance Corps, and the National Socialist People's Welfare Service, helping wounded civilians or guiding neighbors to shelters. In the armed forces, women served almost entirely in auxiliary roles. About 500,000 joined uniformed services of the Wehrmacht, for example, news relay as Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen in the Luftwaffe or Nachrichtenhelferinnen in the Army Signal Corps. The SS even formed women's training schools and camp guard units, such as in Ravensbrück concentration camp. All told, by 1945, German women constituted roughly 85% of clerical and administrative staff in the offices and headquarters and filled most of the shipping, accounting, and language jobs that freed men for the front. Nursing also became...
Meanwhile, everyday Italian women faced terror and chaos. In bomb-stricken Rome or Milan, women knelt in churches praying or tending the wounded after raids. Those in line at shops endured occasional summary arrests by fascist militiamen for curfew violations. In farms, hunger was severe by winter 1944-45. Families survived on chestnuts and polenta. However, there were pride and relief when American or British troops arrived. Italian women greeted them with kitchen knives turned into forks for picnics in the vineyards and improvised sign painting welcoming the liberators. By war's end, Italian women's wartime service bolstered a new social status. Italian women won the right to vote in 1946 as a nod to their sacrifices and activism. Key Italian contributions included agriculture and industry. Under long hours and with minimal gear, women in Italy planted and harvested food under German oversight. In factories, like steelworks in southern Italy or bombed Milan, women often operated machinery and cast shells for Mussolini's army, especially after 1943. Resistance leadership. Tens of thousands of women were active in partisan cells. They helped escort escaped POWs across checkpoints, hid Jewish families, and sabotaged rails. The Milanese partisan Titina, Tigrina Isola, and hundreds like her were celebrated after the war as heroines. Clerical and volunteer roles. In liberated areas, women took up clerical jobs in the new Italian army headquarters, translated for Allied officers, many spoke English and Greek, and continued nursing the wounded, carrying on Italy's tradition of Catholic and Red Cross nurses. Civilian bravery. Italian women endured late-war famine and reprisals. After a village execution of partisans, it was often the wives and daughters who bravely confronted the soldiers, begging for the bodies of the dead. Japan's wartime role for women was shaped by its rigid traditional culture and later by desperation. Prior to the war, most Japanese women worked if they had to, often poor or unmarried, in textile or light industry. Married women typically stayed home. The good wife, wise mother ideal meant the government initially did not draft women into factories. Instead, women were expected to raise children loyal to the emperor and keep the household afloat. The propaganda image of a wartime Japanese woman was one of serene devotion, though in reality, mothers baked sweet potato cakes from meager ingredients and neighbors shared soup. As war dragged on, especially after the 1943 Battle of Leyte Gulf and mounting losses, Japan faced a severe labor shortage. In the last 2 years of the war, over 4 million Japanese women were recruited into factories and shipyards, about 19% of the female labor force by 1945. Cities like Nagoya, Osaka, and Tokyo assembled young women in dormitories so they could work in aircraft factories or munitions plants. They stamped gun parts, riveted metal sheets, and ran looms for parachute silk, often for 12 to 14 hours a day, sometimes under blackouts. Even Buddhist and Shinto shrines urged women to give up jewelry for copper, and girls in high school took turns working on assembly lines. These efforts were often called patriotic work rather than paid jobs, and official wages were low, reinforcing the expectation of self-sacrifice. In rural Japan, women carried on ancient farming traditions, planting rice and harvesting tea. As many men died or remained overseas, villages relied on grandmothers and 12-year-old girls to operate the heavy bamboo rice binders and irori hearths to cook grain. War guest lanterns hung in homes at night, and ration card systems meant children sometimes only ate 1 or 2 small meals a day. The devastating U.S. firebombing of Tokyo, March 1945, and atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to mass civilian casualties. Women among the victims include tens of thousands of young students and office workers trapped in burning city blocks. Those who survived often lost husbands and sons, and some mothers carried the ashes of their family from crematoria back to villages. There were also hidden tragedies unique to Japan. The military's comfort women system forcibly enslaved women from Korea, China, and even some Japanese women. While not part of any patriotic narrative, this remains a grim part of how women were used by Japan's war machine. By the very end, Japanese propaganda, once about gentle motherhood, tried to summon women as militia or volunteer corps to defend the home islands and factory hands. Banners proclaimed that Japanese women must work tirelessly so that our honorable men could focus on battle. When the war ended in surrender, many Japanese women faced occupation forces. The Allies took measures that, in effect, liberated women by granting them legal rights like suffrage and educational access. But Japanese women themselves often remained bound by traditional village ties until more gradual reforms took root. Key Japanese contributions included mass mobilization for factories. By 1944, some 4 million able women, unmarried or old enough, worked in aircraft, electronics, and munitions industries. They wore navy blue worker smocks and sometimes lived in cramped factory dorms. Agricultural labor. Women maintained rice paddies and tea fields while men were away. They used power or water buffalo for plowing and crowded communal kitchens to make miso and pickles. Home defense and service. As American air raids grew, women joined air raid nursing associations and helped build underground shelters. Thousands volunteered in patriotic societies, teaching younger girls hymns about sacrifice or bending scrap metal into shells. These images contrasted sharply with the exhaustion many women felt standing at noisy lathes far from home. Across continents, women's war work shared some powerful commonalities. Whether in New Jersey or Normandy, Soviet steppes or Shanghai, women faced long hours, fatigue, and the ache of absent fathers and husbands. They learned to do double duty, caring for families with empty cupboards after a night of keeping factory lights burning or hospitals staffed. Everywhere, women organized informal support networks, quilting bees to turn scraps into blankets, sewing circles to repair uniforms, or canteens where volunteers fed tired workers. New bonds formed. Factory friends became factory sisters, and women of different backgrounds bonded over shared battle to keep life going. In face of fear, air raids in London or Tokyo, cold Russian winters, or famine in the Philippines, they found courage. Many left behind memoirs and letters noting how ordinary moments felt extraordinary. The first airplane they built rolling off the line, a telegram finally arriving that a son was safe, or the smile of a comrade in a bomb shelter. Yet each nation also had unique hurdles. In totalitarian Germany and Japan, ideological constraints initially limited women's roles until necessity overruled propaganda. In Britain and America, the tension between temporary wartime gains and post-war expectations was poignant. Women yearned to keep their newfound independence, even as society pushed family-first ideals. In the USSR, gender equality had been a stated ideal, so women fought openly, but they also bore enormous burdens, like carrying children to safety while wielding a rifle, for instance. France and Italy endured occupation and civil strife that pitted neighbors against each other, making every act of resistance personally perilous. In all countries, racial and social divisions framed experiences. Black women in the U.S. and colonies had additional struggles for equality, whereas in the USSR, official doctrine promised equality, though Russian women still faced pay gaps. Statistically, the impact was staggering. All told, tens of millions of women worldwide entered workplaces or services they had never known before. In the United States and United Kingdom, the percentage of women in the industrial labor force jumped by more than half during the war years. By 1945, women ran two-thirds of Soviet factories. In sheer manpower, the Axis and Allied economies relied on these efforts. Allied victory was, in no small part, due to the fact that American and British women outproduced the Axis home fronts. But beyond numbers, the era was profoundly personal for the women themselves. The war laid bare what millions of women could do when called upon, while also reminding societies of the costs of their absence from traditional roles, a complex legacy that would fuel debates on women's rights for decades. Each of these stories, of Rosie, the land girl, the partisan couriers, the nurse on the Eastern Front, the rebellious German student, the stoic Japanese factory worker, paints a vivid picture of how war reshaped gender and society. In classrooms and memorials today, these women deserve remembrance alongside soldiers. They held governments and industries together when the front lines were miles away, and they carried their own emotional battles at home. In World War II, millions of women proved themselves unsung frontline heroes, and their bravery and labor are remembered as cornerstones of the Allied victory and lessons for all nations.